This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the band was speckled and there were 6 Napoleons, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about why Dr. Watson was called James by his wife? Or of Sherlock Holmes's dining habits? Or what happened when he let a criminal escape?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 190, Women in the Canon, Part 2. Hello and welcome once again to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast, where we talk about the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you part 2, Burt Wolder, or is this the original?
No, actually, I'm the reprint with the misprint at the bottom of my right knee.
I was looking for your errata slip. Sadly, I'll be looking for a while, I think. Well,
Yes.
folks, if you would like the show notes to this episode to comment on or just have a record of where to find it, it is at ihose.co/trifles190, all lowercase. We do appreciate your feedback, which you can give to us in pretty much any format. If you'd like to email us, it's trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. We are I Hear of Sherlock on all of the major social networks. And of course, you can leave a comment right on the show notes page itself. We do encourage you to support us, even if it's just for $1 a month on Patreon. Every amount helps, and we do appreciate the power of the community. You know, so many of you write to us and tell us about how you appreciate the show, and we appreciate your support in return. So for those of you who are supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal, thank you very much, and we hope to continue to deserve your support. Well, this is the 3rd week in the month, which is traditionally in this season the week where we take a piece of scholarship from the past and we do some commentary on it, either critiquing it or simply sharing it for listeners or readers who might not have otherwise come across it. And the last month started a 4-part series of women in the canon. If you recall, we talked to you about Molly Hardwick's contribution of women in the canon from the Sherlock Holmes Journal, Volume 10. She talked about the women of influence. And in this month's episode, we'd like to get to a version of Women in the Canon, Part 2, called The Working Girls by Patsy Dalton. This also comes from the Sherlock Holmes Journal, Volume 10, Number 2. So why don't we simply start out first by defining what it is that Ms. Dalton meant when she said working girls. Can you help us out with that, Bert?
Yes, and it's interesting, just to give listeners a peek ahead. As Scott just mentioned, this is part of a series, and so now we're talking in the second installment in this paper by Patsy Dalton. But a future installment, Ms. Dalton had another paper, and her name morphed into Pat Dalton at that point. So there'll be 2 Daltons, and then we're going to be getting back to Molly Hardwick for the 4th installment. But for this, in terms of working girls, it's really interesting. It's one of the points, in fact, that Patsy or Pat Dalton makes in the start of this particular paper. She says, the really interesting working women of the period didn't seem to get themselves involved in crime. And so you don't see, she says, in the canon, women who were changing the face of the women's world. You don't see the doctors, the teachers, the social workers, the reformers. Either they never crossed the path of Sherlock Holmes or Watson, or that they just weren't interested in them. But these women, says Ms. Dalton, are working in the same professions that their mothers could have worked in the same respectable callings for which they needed the minimum of training and which they could leave the moment a gentleman offered marriage as an alternative. And it's a pity, for it means, she says, that these girls, and that's her word, girls, lack the character, vitality, and importance of their sisters, who were digging the holes in which the women's movement was eventually to take root and to flourish. So these are uh, working girls who had, Pat Dalton says, time for diversions. Maybe it's because they were bored. And it could be that some of them did not take their work as governesses or typists and music teachers as seriously as they might
I love that line because, as we will see, in a few instances, neither did their employers. The people the men who hired them to fill these roles, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But she's very clear in her definition here when she says, "I am, of course, referring to the ladies, the non-ladies, the maids, ladies' maids, housekeepers, and cooks." Had a far more interesting time. I think that sentence right there is worth pausing on because, first of all, in a class system, she could discern between ladies and non-ladies because what I was thinking of when I saw women in the canon, the working girls, I was thinking more along the lines of maids and cooks and the like. And aren't they really the ones that have the best stories to tell, that observe everything that goes on from the silent corners of the room or the bowels of the house, who really know the workings of the household?
have. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So they do see what's going on and they have their own unique perspective and they are looking at things objectively and comparing it to their own experience. And some of them could be very amusing, but also, as we know from women in the canon, they can be very thoughtful and observant, and in
Mhm.
the cases of some of them, very action oriented. But I like the way Pat Dalton began this particular essay with two wonderful sentences, and this is how she sort of gets into this whole section. She says, "They did not, it would seem, work very hard, and with one exception, they dropped what they did at the slightest encouragement."
Oh boy. Well, why don't we take a look? Because the women that came to Sherlock Holmes's attention, the working girls that came to his attention, as Patsy calls them, all had fascinating stories. We probably wouldn't have gotten the same kind of um, scenarios out of the cooks, the maids, etc., because they didn't have agency. They weren't in control of the world around them. Now, of course, in Victorian and Edwardian times, women at large didn't have agency, but these working girls that came to Sherlock Holmes at least had the ability to seek him out as a client, or to position themselves as a client and to seek him out, and to be able to pay him because they were largely um, they were largely financially secure in their positions. So who were some of these working girls that Ms. Dalton introduces us to, Bert?
Well, we can skip over Irene Adler really with just a sentence or two. First of all, because of her prominence in the canon. But Pat Dalton makes a very interesting point about Irene Adler. Compared to some of the other working girls that we're going to be talking about in the canon, Irene Adler was extraordinary because she had a choice. She had the gift of her musical talent. And, says Pat Dalton, if she'd wished to do so, she could have been a major operatic star rather than to associate herself with the king of Bohemia. Um, she could have just pursued a music career and focused on that, but she had a choice. But there are not many women in the canon who have such a choice. And so for most of them, the positions that they're in are cases of them accepting a respectable way of earning a living. And governessing is still the top job for helpless ladies.
Hmm.
So
I
one
want to.
one. So
I
yeah,
just
go
want
ahead.
to interject something there, Bert, because I know we said we wouldn't spend too much time on Irene Adler simply because of her prominence, but just one thing comes to mind when uh, Patsy says she had a choice, right, and she chose to align herself with the King of Bohemia, who later spurned her. Um, can you imagine how she must have felt given that she gave up her career basically to become a mistress, a full-time mistress, and that profession, that role was then taken from her.
Well, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. Although, the idea of Irene Adler, making. I mean, it's one thing to pursue particularly when you're a gifted singer and a musician, to pursue a career on the operatic stage, and the other to decide, from now on, I think I'm going to be the king's mistress. I don't know. We don't know very much about how those
Well,
events happened and how she
who
wound up
who
in that.
among us has not had that decision to make, Bert? Well, why
Yeah.
don't we why don't we look at one of the governesses, Signora Victor Durando from Wisteria Lodge, and isn't this interesting? That again, an indication of how uh, women were thought of and treated at the time. We don't have her first name, do we? She's
No, I
always
mean,
Senora Victor. She takes her husband's name, who is dead, of course, but we never learn her first name.
yeah, yeah. It's a glorified way of saying, Mrs. Victor Durando. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Well, Pat Dalton points out that she again here is a governess governed by circumstances rather than by some drive to educate or to nurture or to contribute to the development of a new generation of children. And she says, she was a working woman, all right, and she was working probably better as an undercover agent than as a governess.
that's impressive right there. She she was working two jobs, really, and doing pretty well at it. She had to be fairly educated to be able to assume the position of a governess and to be hired by such a high level official. She must have done pretty well by herself even before taking up her liberal causes.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing. We never hear very much about many of these women's academic qualifications. And so, you can sort of go from Mrs. Victor Durando to Grace Dunbar. And Pat Dalton points out that we know nothing of her academic qualifications for the position of governess, but since her employer was a millionaire and presumably prepared to pay for the best, uh, one can presume that she had some and that she passed some sort of, rigorous review. But, Pat points out that really what kept her anchored in that position was the fact that other people were dependent upon her earnings. And second, that she felt that she had a real role to play using her influence, her own strength of character, uh, her ability to control and shape and contribute to Neil Gibson's power, immense strengths being used in some positive way. So, but that's not the same at all of saying, I'm a governess and I take this responsibility very seriously, and this is my number one purpose in doing what I'm doing and why I'm here and why I'm sticking through this.
Yeah. Well, we will continue on this discussion of the working girls right after this quick word from our sponsor.
Yes, we're in the middle of one of those Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist episodes of Trifles, where we're looking at a classic piece of Sherlockian scholarship.
Well, where can you find classic Sherlockian scholarship? Well, there are a couple of places, and we can think of one of them right off the bat that's available right now. It's The Grand Game, Volume 2, which contains Sherlockian scholarship from a variety of sources, mostly the Baker Street Journal, from 1960 to 2010. Volume 2 is all that's left because Volume 1 was so popular, it sold out. We'll have more news on bringing Volume 1 back from the dead in future episodes, but for now, get on over to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and pick up your copy of Volume 2 of The Grand Game, covering the last half-century of Sherlockian scholarship. You won't find better work in a single volume anywhere else. Go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and get The Grand Game Volume 2 today. We're back talking about the working girls in the canon. We were really focusing on governesses here, and certainly one of the most prominent governesses that we come across is Violet Hunter, who of course had to take care of little Edward Rucastle, who was busy killing cockroaches and other vermin around the Copper Beaches. But she was very clear about her qualifications. And Patsy says maybe she was a little too modest when she listed them. She had a little French, a little German, music, drawing, the bearing and deportment of a lady, 5 years experience, and considerable courage. That put her as a I would think a highly sought after governess. And of course, she was scooped up for what was it, 100 pounds a year by Jeffro Rucastle.
Mm. Yeah, well, which was which was a generous wage. We like to think, and I think because of the experience of Violet Hunter and what she's able to accomplish and how she handles herself in that situation over a period of time, what she has to deal with, and the resourcefulness with which she keeps Sherlock Holmes engaged, and the clarity with which she states her case when she first meets Holmes. I think all of these suggests that maybe she was a little too modest when she was talking about her qualifications. She clearly um, has already come from one position which she was successful in, with the exception of the fact that the family she was with moved to another country, and she sort of found herself at loose ends. But she really presents as an extraordinary person, and we know by the end of the case that Watson tells us he believes that she becomes a headmistress of a private school in Walsall, and that's a position that nobody who is unqualified can just stroll into. So clearly Violet Hunter um, has experience that we know nothing about, and talents that she's perhaps too modestly described.
Which makes you wonder why she would have had to jump at the first opportunity like she did with Rucastle's. I mean, I know the money looked good, but let's think about this from the other side for a moment. If Rucastle were that intent on getting a well-qualified governess, I think he was a little too aggressive in playing his hand. I believe, if I recall, the amount he was willing to pay was twice the amount of a typical governess. He could have gone 25% more and still managed to bag Violet Hunter as governess for the Copper Beaches.
Well, yeah, but there's all those other things. You have to cut your hair. You have to wear this particular dress.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, there's another Violet who is also a governess, the maltreated Violet Smith from The Solitary Cyclist. Now, she was, by virtue of qualifications, a trained musician, and that is what she was tasked with doing out at. Oh gosh, what was the name of the estate in The Solitary Cyclist?
Oh, good question. I don't remember.
I'm
Wasn't the
blanking.
Copper Beaches? I know that.
Well, we'll have to leave that for another trifling episode. But she had to teach the daughter of Bob Carruthers music.
Mm.
Now here's the thing that puzzles me, and I think that that Ms. Dalton kind of bears it out. She said, one wonders if she knew enough to teach her 5 days a week. Because she was out there during the balance of the week, and she would take the train home on the weekends and spend the time with her mother. But a 10-year-old child taking music lessons 5 days a week from a music teacher in residence. First of all, I can't imagine getting music lessons 5 days a week. I had music lessons once a week when I was a kid, and that was plenty. Can you imagine the drudgery of having to do music 5 days a week? And that brings to mind another question. What else was the Carruthers girl being educated on, and by whom?
Yeah, that is a very good question. Was there more than one teacher in residence? Because it's impossible to, well, it's not impossible, but to take a 10-year-old, I mean, no, you wouldn't put a 10-year-old child in several hours of music education only, 5 days a week. And the question, of course, is whether or not the child was a prodigy. If not, the child would be spending a good deal of time, certainly an hour a day, if not more, practicing, developing some facility with scales on a keyboard or playing violin or some other instrument.
Well, we have two others, and this is an interesting category because Laura Lyons and Mary Sutherland, uh,
Mm.
these were working girls, but they were working girls who were dependent on someone else. So Laura Lyons, of course, was divorced. One would imagine that there would be some alimony there. She was certainly relying on Sir Charles Baskerville for some support throughout. Mary Sutherland, of course, lived with her mother and her stepfather, so had their support. And each of them were employed as typists. So they practiced a skilled trade, right? They actually produced measurable outcomes, and yet they seem to have been paid less or appreciated less than the governesses.
Well, yeah, because as Pat Dalton points out, that it is socially more acceptable, she writes, to be an unqualified governess than a trained typist. So, yeah. Yeah, but the whole unqualified nature of this is really only because in the economy of Watson's recounting the events, he didn't delve deeply into these people's backgrounds except with a reference or an excerpt of how they happen to describe themselves. I mean, in some of these cases, as we've discussed, you have to presume that these people had, significant qualifications and therefore would be superior to someone who simply had the dexterity of essentially copying written text by pressing keys, which I guess was, to me, it's obviously highly skilled, but I'll have to take it as read that it was less socially acceptable.
Well, whether it's dexterity with the digits and text or dexterity in dealing with children, working girls in the canon are by no means just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Bessie!